where we begin, starts with build a team. Then after this, we get into defining team ground rules, negotiating project agreements. It makes it sound like it has a lot to do with procurement. It doesn't. It's mostly about service level agreements. And then we get into procurement a little bit later in process, empowering team members and stakeholders, training, engaging. I know, really engaging and supporting virtual teams. I mean, it's so high level. There's no way that anybody could say, here's how you deal with your virtual team, So those are things that I don't do masteries on. Building a shared understanding is where we really do a deep dive in Agile. We go through Scrum, and then we build on that when we get into scope and so on. So if you don't have a lot of experience with Agile, just be aware that, 50% of the exams coming from the perspective of an Agile or more hybrid type of environment. So if you're not as strong in Agile, that's definitely going to be something that you want to do. In fact, the practice exams that you have on the mastery side of campus, one is just strictly Agile. And I did that because I know a lot of people don't have a lot of experience in Agile terminology, who does what, and how to navigate some of those questions. So there is a really great video that I'm going to recommend once we get into the Agile side of things. That is a huge help. I give it out to all my classes and they're like, oh, that's great. So I will give you the link before we wrap up today. That way you're able to go through and take a look, especially if you don't have a lot of experience with Agile. One of the things that was brought up in the official was this concept of stakeholder versus team. And I think it's probably best to compartmentalize those two things. If you're familiar with PMBOK Guide, the 6th edition, not the 7th, but the 6th edition has what are called knowledge areas. As a matter of fact, you know what? I'm going to give you something to download in the chat, especially when we get into the predictive side. Hold on. Let me know if you're able to download that. And when you do, when you open it up, it's basically all of the processes from the 6th edition. Now, remember, predictive didn't go anywhere. They just retired the 6th edition to accommodate more strategy, that kind of thing. You got it? Awesome. If you open it up across the top, you're going to see initiation, planning, execution, monitoring, and controlling and closing. Got it? Perfect. Thank you. That is basically the life cycle or the process groups of predictive project management, right? If you look down the left-hand side, those are all knowledge areas: integration, scope, schedule, cost, etc. All the way down at the very bottom, you'll see stakeholder. Somewhere in the middle, you see resource management, right? And the reason why I gave you that now is to cordon off. Resources are people, equipment, and materials, but that's your team materials and equipment that we plan for and so on. On the other hand, stakeholders, you'll see identify stakeholders and plan stakeholder engagement, those kinds of things. So they are separated out. Even though your team are considered stakeholders, I want you to kind of separate those out for the purposes of just concept. Stakeholder identification. Maybe you already know your team. So that it's going to be the stakeholders that you need to identify, your customer, that kind of thing. This is iterative, meaning over and over and over again as people come and go on the project. Or you've got a bunch of projects, so you have one big stakeholder register with everybody that you're dealing with, who they are, how you interact with them. Well, what exactly is a stakeholder? I mean, identifying and engaging your stakeholders, that's our responsibility, right? And unless we've got a really bad stakeholder, bad, pesky, horrible person that we're interacting with, it's our job to identify and engage our stakeholders all the way through. So it could be, as the project moves through the life cycle, people come and go. It could be that stakeholders leave the project and go on work on something else, or your organization goes through like a merger, an acquisition, new people coming and going. Otherwise, maybe just identifying them that one time and trying to figure out who are they, what do they want, how do I interact, how do I communicate. In fact, stakeholder management communications are, as a knowledge area, are more tightly integrated than stakeholder and resource questions, because you use good communications in order to engage your stakeholders. One thing that I would definitely say is if you're going through and you're trying to figure out, is this a situation that's asking about communications? Ask yourself, am I planning to distribute any kind of information? A report, an email, a meeting, I'm putting together an agenda. That is all communications. Planning to distributing information. Whereas stakeholder engagement is using good communication to build relationships and gain support and try and reduce, any kinds of negative interactions. But consulting the stakeholders who are most affected and trying to decide, how do we do this? How do we interact with them? For a lot of us, this is not a formal process. For a lot of us, this is just, hey, this is how we roll. I've worked with these stakeholders before. I know what they want. But at the same time, PMI would say, okay, let's pretend this is a brand new project. You've never worked with these people before. You have no idea who they are. So now you've got to go forth, figure that out, Sherlock it, determine how to interact with them, how to communicate with them, what their level of power over the project work is, and what is their level of interest in the day-to-day. If you've ever been invited to meetings you had no business being in, that's what I'm talking about. You're like, why am I here? Complexity of stakeholder relationships, interrelationships, that could be hierarchical, political, how you're going to communicate with them, how often, what time zones, that kind of thing. On the flip side of predictive, we have this agile adaptive environment. One thing that you're going to see is a common theme of transparent communication, where in a predictive environment, it might be more hierarchical. Like, I've got to go to this person before I can talk to that person, or I'm only reporting to these people. In Agile, the assumption is that everybody knows what's going on at all times, the stakeholders, the team, etc. And so having these regular, frequent interactions with those stakeholders, and they call it aggressive, transparent communication, which to me sounds like, that's not what I mean. I mean that we are actively transparent. Due to a high degree of change on the Agile side, even more important. So my predictive people, chances are you're setting baselines that people approve, right? Here's our schedule baseline. Here's our cost baseline. Everybody goes, yay, cross your fingers, hope it works out. And then you go through this formal change control where you're updating any changes to those baselines or performance, etc. Whereas in Agile, there aren't any baselines. And so as things change or adapt and adjust, we need to make sure that those people are communicated with. Inviting stakeholders to meetings, that kind of thing is probably happening more so in a true Agile environment than it is on the predictive side. So trying to figure out not just Agile or adaptive, but the process of identifying people, organizations impacted by the project, what we document or need to document as far as relevant information to help us do that. And this is more for our eyes rather than, oh, we're going to share it with everybody and everybody's all on the same page. It's more, what do I need to document to help me identify stakeholders and then interact with them? But one of the reasons why I wanted to do this is for a couple reasons, actually. Some assumptions that are made about what is a stakeholder, and then assumptions that are made about key or crucial stakeholders involved in a predictive and Agile type of project. So very first thing, how many of you have a project management office and or change control board, change approval board? How many of you have a project management office that oversees project management work? There are 3 different levels of PMOs. We'll talk about that, but they're overseeing portfolios, programs, projects. Okay, so Darby says no PMO, yes, change approval board. Kimberly, change approval board, yes, maybe not a PMO. And so the assumption that PMI makes, you've got a PMO, is that all predicted projects, nothing, I'm the PMO, is that we have a project management office and their job is to standardize project management process. They come in 3 different types. You've got supportive, controlling, and directive. Supportive is like, hey, we've got templates. Usually when an organization starts to create a PMO, it was like, hey, here's templates, here's some best practices. Oh, we've got cookies. Commissioners count acts as a change approval board. All right. So the controlling PMO says, we've got everything the supportive does, but you must use these reports, this software, this is how we update meetings. Directive, you're like reporting to them. They are directing how you do it. That doesn't mean you're not in charge. You are of your projects, but they're telling you, here's the rules, here's all the documentation that we need. So they do come in a variety of different like control functions, but they are considered a key stakeholder. The change control board is what PMI calls it, change approval board, commissioner's court, whatever it is, same thing. They approve formal change requests in a predictive environment. So the assumption is in that predictive traditional waterfall side, we have a baseline, and if any changes are necessary, they have to be processed through a change control board. Now, there's one that I left off, and this is the other reason I wanted to talk about stakeholders, is just to clarify. And I'm just going to preempt this question with, if you answer a question incorrectly in class, there's no, don't worry about it. Don't be embarrassed by it. Don't be like, oh, definitely still chat in, because just putting your fingers on the keyboard helps you retain information. But the reason I ask this question is because a lot of times people, depending on their environments and how they label end user, get the question wrong. So let me ask you this. An end user, let's say I walk into a big box software store and I'm looking for photography editing software, and I buy one and I take it home, I install it, and I use it. I'm an end user, right? Am I a stakeholder? Yes or no? Walk into a store, my own volition. All right, so there's some no's and some yeses coming in. Anybody else? This is why I ask, okay? Because this is PMI's perspective. I'm not a stakeholder. I'm an end user, and it's okay. Question marks are totally fine. I'm an end user, but I'm not a stakeholder. I was not involved in any requirement collection, direction, updated throughout the creation of that software. I simply walked into a store and I bought it as an end user. Stakeholders have to be part of the project life cycle to be considered a stakeholder. And so the flip side of that, when I would be both an end user and a stakeholder, would be, let's say, I'm glad to fall for the team, right? Let's say I am the HR department or director or something like that. And I go to the IT department and I say, look, we need a new payroll software, right? Can you investigate it? Here's our budget. Here's what we need it to do. Here's, the calendar that we're looking for, ease of use, cost, etc. Here's all my requirements for this software. Now go forth, find it, buy it, install it, and teach us. So the IT department goes out and does that, right? Meets the requirements, installs it, teaches them, project's over. HR is now the end user, but they were also a stakeholder. Does that make sense? So a stakeholder, as far as PMI is concerned, has to be part of the project lifecycle. They have requirements that we have to collect. They can be identified. Now, when you look at the more agile side of things, if that's sort of where you are, in a lot of cases, when we develop software, we create an avatar or a persona of somebody real or fictional that's going to utilize our software, and we build it with that in mind, but even still, not considered stakeholders on the project. So thank you for chatting in. Don't worry if you don't know. Don't worry if you got it wrong. As far as PMI is concerned, stakeholders have to be part of the project life cycle period. They could be end users also, but they can't just be end users. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions on that? And that's why I wanted to do the mastery, because that's not implicitly or explicitly clear as far as the official content. As far as skills, they start to throw out, remember, we're in the people domain, so there's going to be some soft skills, etc., that we'll see over and over and over again. We're going to dig in much more into conflict management next week, but that cultural awareness, we'll address that with the code of conduct, professional ethics, which I do a mastery on. But decision making, facilitation, leadership, meeting management, that kind of thing. It's servant leadership, which is an agile term that is basically saying that we are not managers. We don't manage people or work. We lead people. So we practice more leadership. Servant leadership just means what we call carrying the food and water in some cases, but you're a coach. You're a facilitator. You practice leadership, emotional intelligence, good communications. You help your team become self-directed, self-managed. So let me ask you this. Do you spend more time in management or leadership in your day-to-day? There's no wrong answer at all. Because it really does depend. If you're more predictive, you probably spend more time managing tasks and assigning people, keeping track of people. Whereas if you're more on the agile or agile/hybrid, maybe more leadership. You don't know, Lisa? That's okay. Darby, management. Dave, leadership, removing barriers for team members. Perfect. Yes. So we need both, right? There's both. But when I say servant leadership, it's what Dave's talking about. Leadership, removing barriers or impediments from the team's progress, which is a lot more agile than predictive. And you know what? While I'm thinking about it, let me just give you this video. Also, on campus, there's a document which is a list of helpful links. Leadership too, Sherry? That's awesome. List of helpful links. That is a YouTube video. And if you forget the link or you forget to copy it down or you don't click on it now or whatever, just go out to YouTube and search product ownership in a nutshell. Has anybody seen this video? It's an animated video. It's probably one of the best videos that I've ever seen that lays out agile project management, generic agile, from the perspective of what's called a product owner. A product owner is about as close to a project manager as you can get on an agile team. And so there are three positions. You've got the product owner who collects the requirements and all of that, which is what that video is about. Then you have a coach, a facilitator, servant leader, scrum master. There's a lot of different labels for a servant leader. Their job is to facilitate, coach, help the team remove impediments or barriers to their performance and their, how they're executing work. And then you have the development team who does the work. So that particular video, I would definitely check out if you're not familiar with Agile before we get much more into Agile terminology or frameworks, things like that. I think it's going to be a huge help. A lot of people find it, even people that work in Agile, oh, I learned something. But it's a really great video from the perspective of a product owner. And then we have this servant leader who is more of a coach, practices leadership, encourages self-definition, self-organized, self-directed, self-managed teams. They're a facilitator of Agile meetings activities, which we'll talk about. Their job is to remove impediments to progress. The team says, look, we can't work on XYZ because we're getting bombarded with emails from this stakeholder and so on. So what we would do as a servant leader is take on administrative work or try and remove that impediment, go talk to the stakeholders. They also coach the organization, the product owner, and so on. So their job is to provide what the team needs and remove roadblocks. Now, I think this isn't strictly Agile. If you're more on the hybrid side, maybe you do spend more time as a manager. That's what you have to do to execute the work and get it done. But I do think that you're also giving high fives and coaching and providing training as needed and emotional intelligence, good communication, one-on-one meetings, those getting to know your team. So those are all parts, that facilitation, coaching, and so on. But taking on that administrative work as needed is definitely something that you could see come up. In fact, just an example of a situation where this is the correct answer would be you are an agile facilitator, coach. Your team is a bit behind schedule. What can you do to help your team get back on track? So it's because they'll tell you it's agile or predictive or hybrid. They'll tell you. So there's nothing in the question that states the team needs training or more meetings or anything. A high performing team can still be behind schedule. The correct answer would be take on administrative work. There's something that's bogging them down, that's keeping them from being as on schedule as they would like to be. So what would you do in that situation? Take on administrative work. A lot of this is going to be more clear as we go with Agile, but the goal really as a servant leader is to communicate the project vision, perpetuate the vision as often as possible. Keep the team on track. Here's the big picture. Here's why we're doing this. Keep the team from being distracted by interruptions. That could be something that comes up too, where you've got stakeholders that are trying to get involved in things that they have no business getting involved in, like a daily stand-up meeting, for example, where the servant leader would be like, okay, so how would you answer this? You and your team are having your daily meeting. We're just going to call it that, daily meeting for now. And a stakeholder wants to join that meeting. You're a servant leader. What do you say? Sure. It's only 15 minutes, but sure, join. Or no, bye, nicely. What do you say? Sure, join, or no, bye. Bye-bye. Send us a bullet point list. Yeah, we'll get back to you. So that's why I'm asking, because there's a difference in our organizational processes and our enterprise environments that would say, sure, go ahead and join. Whereas, as far as a daily meeting or daily stand-up meeting with your team, the correct answer on the exam is bye. This is by the team, for the team. It's a safe space. No stakeholders. So a lot of these types of questions, this flipping and flopping back and forth between predictive and agile, can get a little bit confusing. So as we go forward, I'll explain each role and what that looks like a little bit more. But yeah, if you're in a predictive environment, somebody walks in your conference room or jumps on your Zoom call or whatever, you're like, sure, come on in. So it's very different way of working. The RACI chart, I just want to bring this up just to remind you, responsibility, assignment matrix, or RAM, and then RACI, responsible, accountable, consult, inform. Those are just two acronyms to be aware of as a way of outlining stakeholder/team, who's responsible for doing the work, who's overseeing it or is accountable, who is the expert judgment that we can go talk to, and who needs to be informed about the progress. Team skill appraisals they brought up. I just wanted to remind that it's holistic. There's not an actual document attached to this. There might be in your real world. Maybe you do one-on-one meetings and you've got a little checklist of things that you go through with that individual of, hey, how's it going? What's working? What's not working? What can I help with? This is more on the team level oversight of, hey, how's my team working together? Are they making good decisions? Are they working as a team? What are their aspirations? What are their preferences for work? Those types of things. So not heavily tested on. It's just more a nod to how we interact with people in projects. All right, so that brings us to the resource management plan. Anytime you see management plan, if you look at that chart that I gave you, you'll see a lot of them. And basically, it falls under every single planning process. Plan scope management plan, requirements management plan schedule management. These are all the how-to guides. These are the rules of engagement for each one of those knowledge areas. If you don't do procurement, you don't need a procurement management plan. One thing that you'll see with predictive project management, it is very document heavy, whereas Agile is the opposite. Documentation without a result is an epic waste of time, right? So documentation is left until the last responsible moment. Go with what we know. Fail faster, succeed sooner. Whereas on the predictive side, we're plotting everything out. And if it doesn't work out the way that we plotted it out, we have to go through change control to update it. The resource management plan is your how-to. How do we identify resources? What are their roles? What are their responsibilities? What's the recognition? Org charts and so on, training. But just to give you an example of my metaphor, if you will, of management plans, chat in what's the last thing that you looked up how to do on YouTube and did it work? What's the last thing? I know, gosh, with this pandemic, like so many DIYs, like how do I fix the light in my refrigerator? How do I clean the gutters? How do I do this? Go out to YouTube and look it up. What's the last thing that you looked up how to do? Might have been a formula. It might have been, something creative, or how to cook something, or what's it? It was kind of fun to talk about too. There's a method to the madness, I promise. Lawnmower repair worked well. Awesome. Dave, able to mow the lawn. What else? What else? Somebody, my last group was like, oh, I looked up, how to do like a certain kind of dance move. Other people to building, furniture. How to string a fishing reel, Robert said. Did it work? Seth, rebuild a small engine? Awesome. Did it work? Timothy, cinematic shooting angles for cell phones. Cool. Yeah, there's the reason I use photography software as my example. That's awesome. Seth, it worked? Yep. Robert, did you really hook yourself? So it didn't work. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's always my biggest fear with fishing. My husband does, but I'm always like dodging hooks. The reason I'm asking is because if you go out and you watch a video on how to do something, and then you try and duplicate it, right? If the video works for you and you're able to duplicate it, great. If you decided a year from now, I can't remember how to build that small engine, or I can't remember what that setting is on my cell phone, you can always go back to that video and watch the how-to, right? If you watch it, try and duplicate it, and you hook yourself, you're like, I'm never watching that video. I need to change the video. Go watch a different video. The management plans are your how-to YouTube videos for each section. So I want you to think about an entire project management plan as your YouTube channel for predictive project management. I need how-to scheduling. I need how-to procurement, how-to risk. If it works, great. If, while you're executing, it doesn't work, formal change control. You got to change something about how you're doing things, because how you're doing things doesn't work. So that's how I want you to think about management plans. It's the rules. It's the how-to video that, great, it's working well. I can continue to refer to it. I can send my stakeholders to it, and they too can learn how to do XYZ. Doesn't work, formal change control. So the resource management plan, even though not heavily tested on, is the first one out of the gate that they threw out there. You'll see a ton of them. But just remember, once everybody's like, yep, that's how we're doing resource management, it gets locked down and has to go through change control to be updated. Thanks for chatting in. It's always fun to see what people are looking up. How to. On the resource management side of things, I also felt like it would be important to talk about, that was pretty generic, how you train people, how you motivate people. I'm more interested in where in the world are you? How many of you deal with different time zones? Even just because I know some of you are in the middle of the US, some of you are on the East Coast, I'm on the West Coast, but we have people all over the place, right? Lisa, you, Kimberly, yes, yeah, Sherry, yep. Yeah, so time zones, even in the US and in some provinces in Canada, also they change time. Drives you crazy. Drives me crazy too. Although in the US, they're talking about getting rid of daylight savings time. That would be great. Arizona never changes time. But when I lived in Pennsylvania, I was like, oh, fall back, spring forward, good. Drives me crazy. Or you're dealing with international business, right? So you've got time zones. There might be language differences. There could be different slang or jargon. If you're working with a customer, right, doesn't get it, doesn't understand. Arizona drives you crazy, Robert, because we don't change. I know. So, and I teach on East Coast time. So I'm always like, is it 3 hours today or is it 2 hours behind? The technology that we have to use, lack of buy-in, context, culture shock. Culture shock isn't just getting off an airplane in a different country. It could be working on a brand new team and coming to a new organization with a new position or being promoted. All those things are culture shock, right? Except I did travel a lot, not just for work, but also for fun. And I always experienced culture shock when I came back to the US. And probably because I was landing in Philadelphia International at the time. Like, Everybody was so polite over there. Now they're screaming at me. But decision making with multi-criteria decision analysis. This is going to be something that you see over and over and over again. It's really just saying there isn't one aspect to make a decision with. There isn't just one consideration. So when we're talking about people, we might be looking at a variety of different things, like how available are they, what they cost per hour, how much experience do they have, are they international, do they need to be international? So we're going to look at a variety of different areas. You'll see this again in like scope and risk and things where we can't just definitively say that's the only variable. This is utilized as sort of a scoring system. I don't know how many of us can sit down and be like, but if I could, I would say I'd rather have somebody with a great attitude than somebody who has a lot of experience who's just a salty person, just doesn't get along with people or just don't work well together. I'd rather have somebody who's like, yeah, I don't have a lot of experience, but put me in, coach, all right, attitude. But it's just basically looking at different variables to acquire resources or engage with your stakeholders. Nothing major that you would need to know. But assignment for resources is, their roles, responsibilities, directories, org charts, schedules, whatever the case may be. However, it's pretty generic. Nothing that you need to memorize. Oh, and by the way, while I'm thinking about management plans, you do not need to memorize headers. They're not going to say, what's the fourth header on the management plan? Right? It's more the generalized vibe of why you would have one in predictive project management. There are 3 management plans that most typically show up. It's risk, quality, and communications. Risk, quality, and communications. And we'll get to those sections. That's all process, but we'll talk about them then, why they're so important, whereas the rest is just sort of either templated, fluff, coming from your PMO, doesn't need to be done, those types of things. But those tend to be the big 3. Risk, quality, and communications. Okay. Let's see. We do some questions. I put some in here, but I just kind of want to talk about stakeholder hierarchy, sponsor, that kind of thing. So if you get it wrong, don't worry. If you're a project manager and during a meeting you learn that the schedule has accelerated from 10 weeks to 4 weeks, because that never happens, and there are no technical resources, the technical resource manager well, what is the first thing you should do? And this is a really good sort of overview of the types of questions you could see. Do you escalate to the sponsor, decision maker, hire somebody outside via procurement, or check with the manager to see if there's a resource you can borrow? All right, so I'm seeing 4s coming in, some escalation. Anybody else? And trust me, do not be afraid to get these wrong. Honestly, it's day 1 of class. All right, so it seems like for the people that have chatted in, that the 4s are more prevalent, and 4 is absolutely correct. So here's the thing, and the reason why I want to bring this up is my real world and the perfect world found on the current PMP exam is very different. We have, in a lot of cases, certain protocols that have to be followed. Dave says, I would want to have the info possible solution before talking it over with the sponsor. That was the point I was getting at. Any answer that has to do with escalating to somebody will be wrong, because we're proactive. We go to them with solutions, not problems. That's exactly right. But in the real world, you might have to escalate. It might be like, I've got no people. Can you please give me some people? There's only 2 reasons why an escalation would be a correct answer. The first one is it's a threat or opportunity event that we cannot get rid of or gain on the project level. Like, we have to go above. The threat event is very real, very impactful, but we can't deal with it. We can escalate that. The only other escalation answer that would be correct is that you've got a stakeholder you cannot deal with, period. You're like, I've tried everything. and I just can't get through to this person, you can escalate to your sponsor. But Dave, you got it. That's exactly right. So ask yourself, like, can I solve this problem? Or is it unsolvable, like a risk situation that might come up? So good. 4 is the best answer. And sometimes I like to throw these in here, not necessarily concept, but to show there are a variety of different answers that could be right. Usually it's a battle between two answers, seemingly correct answers. You're a leader of a high-performing team. Which of the following best describes your role in supporting a high-performing team by building the team skills and keeping them focused and happy on the project? Do leverage and reward, identify and be aware, nurture and motivate, or reward and schedules? I mean, hopefully some of these, it'll be easy to identify, but you've got a high-performing team. You're a leader, not a manager. Leader and manager are different. What would you say? And like I said, I'm kind of throwing these at you. There's maybe some concepts we haven't yet talked about, but just seeing how some of these kind of vague concepts will pop up. You're a leader of a high-performing team, which means they're self-directed, they're self-managed. I know, Dave. It does, right? Wait till we get further into the people domain. You think this is cheesy? Yeah, it is. It's nurture and motivate. Right. And I'm telling you, a lot of these questions are very much based, good job, you guys, very much based on emotional intelligence, nurturing, motivating, coaching, that kind of thing. All right. So remember, RACI and RAM, you borrowed a resource from a functional manager, the team members being asked to work on a critical task outside the project. Which of the following will help the project manager determine how resources are allocated and coordinated with other projects? Which one do you think? Now remember, RACI is responsible, accountable, consultant form. RAM is responsibility assignment matrix. And then you have the resource management plan. We know it's not the schedule because we haven't really talked about that yet. You borrowed somebody from a functional manager. Which one's going to say how to? Remember the how? Yeah, so it's going to go back and forth between responsibility assignment matrix and the resource. There it is, Jonathan. How? Now, the reason I wanted to bring this up is not to confuse anybody, not to be like, wait, what? It's in each one of the questions, there are key phrases that pay. And once you start taking practice exams, and we'll do practice questions and so on, once you start to tear apart the question and start looking for those key phrases, how, not what, which might be, and it's kind of rude to do RACI and RAM because RACI is a type of RAM. So anytime you see that, it's kind of like, if the question said, you have a, spreadsheet that says, Jonathan is responsible or is doing the work, whereas, Karen is overseeing the work or something like that. It would be more outlined to what than how. When it says how resources are allocated and coordinated, how-to guides are always management plans. But you guys are crushing this. Look, it's a way of starting to train the brain of perfect world project management and how it gets presented in situational questions. I mean, there is a reason that the PMP is a difficult exam. It's not impossible. Peeps are passing. I think our pass rate is like 97% or something. So people are passing, but it's getting into that mindset, PMI's mindset. Like it's tough. Sometimes it's like banging your head against the wall. And I always joke that you're going to want to whip your laptop right out the window when you start taking practice exams. People will email, why is this the correct answer? I got to go get my laptop off the lawn. So one of my recommendations, one of my very first exam tips is to kind of wait until, the end of class next week to start taking practice exams, because most practice exams are going to be covering things that we haven't talked about yet. So I would say, wait until the end next week, then take and retake practice exams. One thing that I practice is called micro testing. I realized a long time ago that I would rather clean my garage than sit down for 4 hours and take a 200 or 180 question practice exam. And nobody got time for that. right? So for me, working full time, raising a kid, life, just French, trying to go out on the weekends, things like that. I was like, I don't have time to study. I don't have time to take a practice exam. So what I did instead was say, but I do have time to do 10 questions in the morning instead of checking Facebook and all that. I got 10 minutes in the morning or 20 minutes to do 10 questions. So what I would do is I got in the habit of doing 10 questions in the morning, scoring myself, and then kind of, thinking about it during the day. Why did I get that one wrong? And then I do 10 in the evening sometimes. And I put my pen back right next to the wine opener, which made it so much easier. But if I could knock out 10, 15, 20 questions, different questions every single day, and then when I scored myself, ask myself, did I miss the question because I don't know the content? Or did I miss the question because I was rushing through it? Maybe I wasn't reading carefully. Or did I miss the question because I, just missed a nuance? Like I knew the answer, but I missed that one key phrase. If I read it again, I get it right. Those are the types of things that once you start getting in the habit of doing that, you're going to be clearing way more questions than you would if you tried to sit down and do full-blown practice exams over the weekend or at night when you're exhausted. Kids are finally asleep. It's 9 o'clock. Now I'm going to sit down and do 200 questions. No. So micro testing is definitely a good place to begin. It's also important to make sure that when you start taking and retaking practice exams, that once you start to memorize, it's time to move on. Like, yeah, it feels good because your score goes way up. And you're like, I'm throwing 85%, but you've done the same 100 questions 50 times in a row. You're not helping yourself. You want to make sure that you're getting questions from a lot of different authors, voices, volunteers from around the world write these questions. So it's their perspective of the official content. And so you definitely want to get different voices. There is, and I'll give it to you later because I don't want anybody digging through it yet. But I will give you some resources for free practice exams online. PMI also has a practice exam that you can purchase from them. We're not allowed to use outside vendors anymore. We have to go through them. So if you go to pmi.org, you can see that they've got a practice exam. But we'll talk more about that as we go. It's day 1, but I just figured I would throw that micro testing out there while I was thinking about it. Any questions?